Say you're sorry. She didn't. So he hit her, open hand, across the face, hard enough that the sound cracked through the rain louder than the storm itself. 19 years old, a soaked delivery jacket, a stack of takeout boxes still balanced in both arms. 6 bikers watched, not one of them moved. She didn't cry, didn't run. She just reached up slow and touched her own cheek, like she was checking it was still there. Then she looked him dead in the eye. "You just knocked something out of my jacket," she said. "It's worth more than you'll ever understand." He laughed at that. 8 days later, he wasn't laughing. He was flat on his back in a gravel lot, 400 pounds of his own motorcycle pinning his leg to the ground, staring up at the girl he'd decided was nobody. He never once asked who her mother was. He should have. Some nights, a small town tells you everything you need to know about it. You just have to watch how it treats the people nobody else is watching. This is one of those nights. Rain had been falling since noon, not hard, just steady. The kind of rain that soaks into a person slowly, the way worry does. Marlo Ashwood pulled her scooter into the gravel lot behind Ferris's diner and killed the engine. She sat there a second, just breathing. 19 years old, first year of college. Wet hair stuck to her forehead under a cracked plastic visor. She had 4 more deliveries before her shift ended. 4 more chances for the night to go wrong. She didn't know yet how wrong. Let's back up a little. Let me tell you who this girl was before the world decided to test her. Marlo grew up 2 streets over from where she worked now. Same zip code her whole life. Same church her mother used to take her to before her mother disappeared when Marlo was 4 years old. Nobody in town liked to talk about that. Her Uncle Walt raised her after that. A quiet man. Used to fix engines for a living back before his hands started shaking a little in the cold. He never remarried. Never really explained what happened to his sister. Just told Marlo when she was old enough to ask that some questions take longer to answer than a childhood lasts. She grew up believing that. She grew up patient. Patient the way people are when they've learned early that not everything gets fixed by crying about it. By the time Marlo started college on a partial scholarship she'd fought 2 years for, she was already working nights. Delivery driver for Ferris's Diner. The only place in town that still made pie the old way from scratch in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon every October. Ferris himself was pushing 70. Ran the diner since before Marlo was born. He liked to say the 2 most important ingredients in any recipe were butter and patience. The diner had a wall by the register covered in old photographs, farmers posing next to prize hogs, baseball teams from decades back, uniforms long out of style. A faded picture of the town's 4th of July parade back when the drugstore on the corner still sold penny candy. Regulars liked to point at that wall and tell stories. Ferris liked to let them. "This town remembers itself in here," he told Marlo once, nodding at the photographs while he refilled the napkin holders. "Lose this place, and a piece of that memory goes with it." She hadn't understood back then how literally he meant that. He was fond of Marlo. Said she reminded him of somebody, though he never said who. Maybe he already knew. We'll get to that. For now, all you need to know is this. Marlo was quiet. Marlo was careful. Marlo had a way of looking at people that made grown men feel like she was reading something written on the inside of their skulls. And on this particular Tuesday night in the rain, she was about to meet a man who mistook all of that stillness for weakness. His name was Cole Draven, 27 years old, built like someone who spent a lot of time making sure people noticed how he was built. Leather jacket, silver rings, a motorcycle he kept cleaner than most people keep their homes. Cole ran with a crew called the Iron Wolves, 6 of them, 7 some nights. They weren't outlaws exactly. Not in the way old movies show it. They were something smaller and in some ways sadder. They were young men who liked being feared more than they liked being respected. There's a difference. Some people never learn it. Cole's father was Richard Draven, a man who owned more property in this town than anyone cared to admit out loud. Richard didn't ride motorcycles. Richard wore suits that cost more than most people's trucks. And Richard had plans for a certain stretch of Main Street. Plans that did not include a diner that had been serving pie since 1962. We'll come back to that too. Patience. Remember what Ferris said? That night, the Iron Wolves were parked outside a shuttered auto shop 2 blocks from the diner, waiting on nothing in particular. Just being loud in the rain, the way some men are loud when they don't know what else to do with themselves. Above the shop's front window, mounted years earlier, when the place still sold parts and did oil changes, an old security camera kept watch over the street. Nobody had bothered taking it down after the shop closed. It still ran quietly, feeding into a small recorder in the back room that nobody checked unless something went wrong. Something was about to go wrong. Marlowe's last delivery of the hour was 3 doors down. She had to walk right past them. She didn't slow down, didn't speed up either, just walked boxes balanced in both arms, rain dripping off her chin. "Hey," she kept walking. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Cole stepped off his bike. The others watched the way a pack watches its leader test something new. He didn't ask her to stop. He grabbed the top box off her stack. It happened fast. Faster than she could brace for. The box tipped the lid, popped, and a container of hot soup spilled straight down the front of his jacket. For 1 second, nobody moved. Then Cole's face changed. Some men get embarrassed when something like that happens to them in public. Some men laugh it off. Cole Draven got furious. "You did that on purpose." "No," Marlowe said. Calm, steady. "You grabbed it." That should have been the end of it. A reasonable man would have known that. Cole wasn't interested in reasonable. He grabbed her by the strap of her delivery bag and yanked her toward him. "Say you're sorry." She looked at him. Didn't flinch. Didn't look away either. "I'm not sorry for something I didn't do." That's when he slapped her. Open hand. Hard enough that the sound of it cracked through the wet street louder than the rain. Hard enough that 2 people across the road stopped walking and just stared. Marlowe's head snapped sideways. Her visor flew off and skittered into a puddle. For a moment, everything went hushed inside her own ears, the way it does when something happens too fast for your body to catch up to. Then she straightened. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She reached up slow and touched her own cheek like she was checking it was still there. Then she looked at Cole. Really looked at him. The way you look at someone when you're deciding something about them forever. "You just knocked something out of my jacket," she said quietly. "It's worth more than you'll ever understand." Nobody in that crowd of bikers understood what she meant. Neither did Cole. He laughed a short, ugly sound and shoved her back a step. "Get out of here before I really give you something to cry about." She bent down, picked up the fallen soup container, picked up her visor. And there on the wet pavement, something small had fallen from the inside pocket of her jacket. Something metal. She saw it before anyone else did. Old, tarnished, shaped like a shield. She scooped it up fast, closed her fist around it, and slipped it back inside her jacket before the rain could get to it. Nobody noticed. The security camera above the old auto shop noticed everything. It always did, running quiet and patient in the rain, keeping its own kind of record, the way this whole town seemed to keep records. Nobody looked at until they needed them most. We'll come back to that footage. It matters more than anyone in this story knows yet. Marlowe walked the rest of the way to her delivery without a word. Handed over the food, apologized to the customer for the delay, though it wasn't her fault. Walked back to her scooter, drove back to the diner in the rain, jaw already starting to swell, hands steady on the handlebars the entire way. That's the kind of steady you don't learn from a good life. You learn it from a hard one. Inside Ferris's diner, the lights were warm and yellow against the wet dark outside. Ferris himself was behind the counter, wiping down the register area, getting ready to close for the night. He looked up when the bell over the door rang, looked twice when he saw her face. "Marlowe?" She set her delivery bag down on the counter, careful like it weighed more than it did. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. Your face is red on one side." "I fell." Ferris had run this diner for over 40 years. He'd fed farmers after bad harvests, comforted widows after funerals, listened to heartbroken customers in booth number 4 more times than he could count. He knew better than most people in this town exactly what a lie sounded like when it came out of someone's mouth trying too hard to sound casual. Marlo. She didn't answer right away. He came around the counter, old knees creaking on the way down so he could look at her at eye level instead of down at her. Who did this? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had given her a job when she needed one, who slipped extra pie into her bag on slow nights, who never once asked why a 19-year-old girl worked delivery shifts until 11 at night instead of going to parties like other freshmen. It was one of the Draven boy's friends, she finally said. Cole and his crew. Ferris's face changed. Not fear exactly. Something closer to weariness. The look of a man who has been waiting for a storm he already knew was coming. Did he hurt you? He hit me. I'm calling the sheriff. No. Her voice was firm now, firmer than her face still looked. Don't. Marlo, a grown man, hit you in the middle of the street. I know what happened to me, Mr. Ferris. I was there. He studied her. Something in the way she said it. Something old and tired and careful in a girl who should not have sounded old or tired or careful. You've got a reason for saying that, he said slowly, and it's not because you're scared of him. She didn't answer. Ferris let it go, for now. He got a bag of frozen peas from the kitchen freezer, wrapped it in a dish towel, and pressed it gently against the side of her face. On the house, he said, trying for a small joke. She almost smiled. Almost. Thank you. You should go home. I've got one more delivery. I'll cover it. Mr. Ferris, I need the hours. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slow the way people do when they've decided arguing isn't worth it tonight. Fine, but you're taking tomorrow off. That's not a request. Okay. She held the peas to her cheek and sat on the stool by the register while he closed out the till, both of them quiet, the rain ticking steady against the windows. If you're watching this tonight, maybe you know a girl like Marlo. Maybe you were one once a long time ago. The kind of young person who learned to carry pain without making a sound because somewhere along the way, nobody taught them it was allowed to be loud. There's no shame in that kind of restraint. But there is a cost to it. We'll see that cost play out over the next hour of this story. For now, let's follow Marlo home. She lived in a small house on the edge of town, the same house her Uncle Walt had lived in his whole adult life. White paint peeling at the corners, a porch light that buzzed a little before it caught. Walt was awake when she got home. He usually was these days. Sleep didn't come easy to him anymore, not since his back gave him trouble. He was sitting in his recliner television, murmuring low, a mug of decaf going cold on the side table. He took one look at her face and sat up straight. What happened? I'm okay, Uncle Walt. Marlo. She sighed and sat down on the arm of the couch, peeling off her wet jacket. Some guy on a motorcycle grabbed my delivery. It spilled on him. He got mad. He hit you. It wasn't a question. He could see it plainly enough on her face. Yeah. Walt was quiet for a moment. His jaw worked the way it did when he was holding something back that wanted very badly to come out. He'd been a young man once, too. A different kind of young man in a different kind of world. One that had taught him things about restraint the hard way, back when he served 2 years in the National Guard before Marlo was even born. Helping communities through flood relief and storm cleanup, learning that real strength rarely needs to raise its voice. He never talked about those years much. But they'd shaped him, shaped how he raised her. When Marlo was 7, an older girl at school had shoved her off the swing set for no reason at all. She came home crying, more angry than hurt. Walt had sat her down on the porch steps that evening and told her something she never forgot. You don't have to be the loudest person in a fight to win it, he said. You just have to be the steadiest one. Then he taught her how to fall properly, how to plant her feet, how to turn a wrist without breaking it, how to slip out of a grip instead of fighting it head on. She'd thought it was a game back then, something fun to practice on rainy afternoons in the backyard. Walt patient and careful, never once raising his voice, never once making her feel like the lesson was really about anything more than swing sets. Looking back on it now as an adult standing in a gravel lot with a bruised jaw, she understood it had never been a game at all. It had been preparation for something Walt must have known even then was coming. "You want me to call somebody?" he said finally. "No. Marlo." "No, Uncle Walt, please, not yet." Something in the way she said "not yet" made him look at her harder. "You've got a plan," he said slowly. It wasn't a guess. He knew her too well for it to be a guess. She didn't answer. He studied her face a moment longer, then let out a long breath through his nose. "Your mother used to get that same look," he said quietly. "Right before she did something everybody told her not to do." Marlo's whole body went still. "You never talk about her?" "I know. Why now?" Walt looked down at his hands, old hands scarred from decades of engine work, knuckles thick with arthritis. "Because you're wearing her jacket," he said. "And I think some nights you don't even know it." Marlo looked down at her own jacket hanging wet on the coat hook by the door. An old canvas thing faded with a small tear near the collar that she'd sewn shut herself years ago. She'd always assumed it came from a thrift store. "What do you mean?" she said slowly. Walt shook his head like a man closing a door he'd only meant to crack open an inch. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll talk another time." "Uncle Walt, please, Marlo, not tonight. I'm tired and you're hurt, and neither one of us needs a hard conversation on top of a hard night." She wanted to push. She could see it building behind her own eyes in the reflection of the dark window glass. But she also knew her uncle. Knew when a door was closed for a reason, and knew that slamming your shoulder into it rarely opened it any faster. So she let it go. For now. She went to bed with a bruise blooming slow and purple along her jaw, and a small metal shield tucked safely inside her nightstand drawer, and more questions than she'd had that morning. Sleep, when it finally came slow and shallow. The next morning, Marlo woke to sunlight instead of rain. A rare thing this time of year. She lay in bed a moment, testing her jaw with careful fingers. Sore, swollen a little on one side, not broken. She'd know if it were broken. How did she know that exactly? She didn't stop to ask herself that question yet. It would come later. For now, she just noticed it, the way you notice a strange word you've used your whole life without knowing where it came from. She got up, made coffee, sat at the small kitchen table across from Walt, who was reading yesterday's paper the way he always did one day, behind because he liked to let the news settle before he trusted it. "You look better," he said, not looking up. "I feel worse." "That's how bruises work?" She almost laughed, almost. "Uncle Walt, last night, what you said about the jacket." He set the paper down slowly. "I said we'd talk about it another time. Is this another time?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then finally, he nodded once, like a man agreeing to something he'd been putting off for years. "Your mother—" He started, then stopped. Tried again. "Your mother wasn't just my sister, Marlo. She was somebody who cared more about doing right than doing easy. That got her into trouble more than once." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that made some powerful people in this town very uncomfortable." Marlo's coffee mug stopped halfway to her mouth. "What people—" Walt hesitated. 15 years of silence sat heavy behind his eyes. "I'm not ready to give you names yet," he said quietly. "Not until I'm sure it's safe to." "Safe for who? For you?" The word hung there between them, heavier than either of them expected. "Uncle Walt, I'm 19. I'm old enough to be told the truth." "I know that," he said, and something in his voice cracked just slightly. "But I promised somebody a long time ago that I'd protect you from certain things until the timing was right. I intend to keep that promise a little while longer." She wanted to argue. She wanted to push harder the way any 19-year-old with half her curiosity would have pushed, but she saw something in his face. Something old and worn and careful, the same look she'd worn last night in front of Ferris. She recognized it because it was the same look she wore herself most days. So instead, she reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Okay," she said softly. "When you're ready." He squeezed her hand once, grateful, and neither of them said anything else about it that morning. But something had shifted. A door cracked open just slightly, letting in the thinnest sliver of light. We'll walk through that door together later in this story. I promise you that. For now, let's follow Marlo back to work 2 days later, once the swelling in her cheek had gone down enough that makeup could hide most of it. Ferris didn't ask questions when she walked in. Just nodded, handed her the schedule, and got back to flipping eggs on the griddle. The diner was busy that afternoon. Lunch rush, mostly regulars. Farmers in from the fields, retired folks who came in every day at the same table, a table of college students splitting a plate of fries between classes. And in the corner booth, like she had every Thursday, for as long as anyone could remember, sat a woman named Corinne. Somewhere in her late 40s, though, something in the careful, folded way she held herself made her seem older. Silver, already threaded through dark hair, pulled back neat. A cardigan the color of faded lavender. She always ordered the same thing. Black coffee, wheat toast, a small side of fruit she rarely finished. She never said much to anyone. Just watched the diner go by around her, the way people do when they've spent a long time learning to be invisible on purpose. Marlo had waited on her 100 times. Never thought twice about it. But that Thursday, when Marlo came by to refill her coffee, Corinne looked up at her and her eyes caught on something. Not the fading bruise on Marlo's jaw, though she clocked that too, and her mouth tightened just slightly. She was looking at the collar of Marlo's jacket, at the small tear sewn shut with uneven stitches. Her hand trembled just slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "That's an old jacket," Corinne said quietly. Marlo blinked, surprised the woman had spoken at all. In 2 years of serving her, Corinne had never said more than "thank you" and "check, please." "It was a hand-me-down," Marlo said. "I think." "Where did you get it?" Something in the woman's voice made Marlo pause. Not suspicious exactly, just careful. Too careful for a question about a jacket. "My uncle gave it to me, years ago. Said it belonged to somebody in the family." Corinne's eyes stayed on that torn collar a moment longer than felt normal. Then she looked up, and whatever had flickered across her face smoothed itself back into polite distance. "It suits you," she said simply, and picked her coffee back up. Marlo refilled it, said thank you, and moved on to the next table, thinking nothing more of it. But if you had been standing where I'm standing right now, watching this whole story from above, you would have seen Corinne's hand shaking just slightly for the rest of that afternoon. You would have seen her leave a bigger tip than usual. You would have seen her sit in her car in the parking lot for nearly 10 minutes before she finally started the engine and drove away. Some secrets take a long time to find their way to daylight. This one had been buried for 15 years. It wasn't ready yet, but it was stirring. That same afternoon, a man named Harold, who'd farmed corn just outside town for 50-some years, waved Marlo over to his usual spot at the counter. "Heard about what happened to you," he said, keeping his voice low. "Word travels fast around here." Marlo felt her cheeks warm. "It's not a big deal, Mr. Harold." "It's a big deal to me," he said, and there was something firm underneath the gentleness of it. "My granddaughter's about your age. I'd want somebody to look out for her. She ever got treated that way." He patted the counter twice the way older men sometimes do when they've said something they mean but don't know how to say any softer. "You keep your chin up, you hear me? This town's got more good people in it than bad. Sometimes the bad ones are just louder for a while." "Thank you," Marlo said, and meant it more than he probably realized. She thought about that exchange for the rest of her shift, about how many small kindnesses moved through a small town every single day, invisible unless you were paying attention. An old farmer sliding an extra $1 into a tip jar. A neighbor shoveling somebody else's walk before their own. A diner owner keeping a promise to a friend 15 years gone, even when he didn't fully understand what that promise was protecting. It was easy, she thought, to notice cruelty when it showed up loud and sudden in a parking lot. It took more effort to notice all the ordinary decency holding a town together underneath it. She was starting to notice both now, and she had a feeling she wouldn't be able to stop. Let's leave Corinne there for now and follow the other thread of this story. The one wearing a leather jacket and riding away his own kind of trouble. Cole Draven had not thought much about the delivery girl since the night of the rain. Or rather, he told himself he hadn't. But something about the way she'd looked at him kept surfacing at odd moments. Not fear. He was used to fear. Fear was easy. Fear made sense to him. What he'd seen in her eyes wasn't fear. It was something closer to pity. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He didn't have much time to sit with the feeling, though, because 2 days later, his father called him into the office at Draven Property Holdings, the kind of call that never meant good news. Richard Draven's office took up the top floor of the only building in town, with more than 3 stories. Glass walls, a view of Main Street below, including, if you looked just right, the front awning of Ferris's diner. Richard didn't look up from his desk when Cole walked in. "Sit." Cole sat. "I heard about the incident on Tuesday," Richard said, still not looking up. "It wasn't a big deal. Some delivery girl spilled soup on me. You hit her." Cole shifted in his seat. She was being disrespectful. Richard finally looked up. His eyes were the same shade of gray as his son's, but colder, sharper. The eyes of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how far he could push people before they pushed back. "You hit a 19-year-old girl on a public street in front of witnesses while wearing a jacket with our family's business logo stitched on the sleeve." Cole's jaw tightened. "I said it wasn't a big deal." "It's a very big deal," Richard said, voice level controlled. "Do you understand what's happening on Main Street right now?" "The land deal." "The land deal," Richard repeated. "In 9 days, the town council votes on the rezoning that lets me buy out that entire block, diner included. I have spent 2 years greasing the right wheels to make that vote go smoothly. The last thing I need is a viral video of my son slapping a college girl in the street. Nobody's making a video. You'd be surprised what people are always making these days." Cole shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like the direction this was heading. "So what do you want me to do?" Richard leaned back in his chair, studying his son for a long moment. "I want you to keep doing exactly what I've been paying you to do," he said. "Keep an eye on the diner. Keep an eye on the people who work there. Make sure nobody gets any ideas about digging up old paperwork before the vote." Cole frowned. "What old paperwork?" Richard's expression flickered just slightly, a door opening a crack, then shutting fast. "That's not your concern," he said. "Your concern is making sure nobody causes trouble for me before that vote happens. That's it. That's the job." "And the girl?" "Leave the girl alone," Richard said. "For now, she's not important. Just don't give me another headline." Cole nodded, though something in him didn't quite sit right with the conversation. He'd been doing jobs for his father for years now, intimidating a competing bidder here, leaning on a reluctant seller there. It had always felt in some vague way like family business, like helping out. This felt different. He couldn't have told you why not yet, but it did. He left his father's office more unsettled than when he'd walked in, and he rode his motorcycle out past the edge of town, out where the roads went quiet and the fields opened up wide under a gray autumn sky, trying to shake the feeling. It didn't shake easy. Back at the diner, life went on, the way small town life does, one ordinary day stacked carefully on top of another. Marlo worked her shifts, went to her classes, studied criminal justice in the evenings, at the kitchen table books, spread out next to Walt's newspaper, the two of them keeping each other company without needing to fill the silence. She noticed things over those next few days that she hadn't let herself notice before. She noticed that she could read a room the second she walked into it. knew almost instantly who in a crowded diner was upset, who was hiding something, who needed a kind word, and who needed to be left alone. She noticed that when an elderly regular named Mr. Pruitt stumbled slightly on his way out one afternoon, his cane catching the edge of the doormat, she was already at his elbow before she'd consciously decided to move, steadying him with a grip that felt practiced rather than lucky. "Fast hands," he said, chuckling once he'd found his balance again. "Lucky reflexes," she said. Though even as she said it, she wondered whether luck was really the right word for something that kept happening over and over. She noticed that when she closed her eyes at night, replaying the moment Cole grabbed her jacket strap, her body remembered exactly how to break that grip. Remembered it the way you remember something you've practiced 1,000 times, not something you've only imagined. Where had she learned any of that? She didn't have an answer yet, but the question had started to hum quietly under everything else in her life, the way a distant engine hums somewhere just outside a window you haven't opened yet. The next afternoon before her shift started, Marlowe walked over to the county records office on Maple Street. Small brick building older than the courthouse it sat behind, staffed by a single clerk most days. She didn't fully know what she was looking for. She just knew she wanted to understand the shape of the thing everyone kept talking around. The clerk, a heavyset woman named Doris, who'd worked there longer than Marlowe had been alive, looked up over her reading glasses. "Help you find something, hun?" "I'm trying to understand the rezoning vote," Marlowe said. "The one about Main Street?" Doris's expression shifted just slightly. Careful the way everyone in this story kept getting careful whenever that particular topic came up. "That's public record," Doris said. "I can pull the file for you. Won't have everything, though. Some of the older paperwork from that block got moved to storage years back after the flood damaged the basement here. Never did get properly reorganized." "Is there a way to find it?" "There's a warehouse out past the fairgrounds where the county keeps old records," Doris said. "But you'd need a reason and a form signed off by the council clerk to go digging through boxes that haven't been touched in years." Marlowe filed that away carefully. A warehouse, old boxes, a form she didn't yet have permission to request. She spent the next hour at a small table by the window, reading through what public files did exist. Zoning maps, meeting minutes from recent council sessions, names she recognized and a few she didn't. One name kept appearing again and again in the margins of older documents, always in connection with land purchases along Main Street, going back decades. Draven, not just Richard. His father before him and his father before that. 3 generations of the same family quietly buying up the ground beneath this town, one small parcel at a time. It wasn't illegal. Not on its own. People bought land all the time. But something about the pattern made the hair on Marlowe's arms stand up. A slow, patient hunger spread out over decades, always circling closer to the same handful of blocks, including the one Ferris's diner sat on. She left the records office that afternoon with more questions than she'd walked in with, and a growing certainty that whatever her uncle and Ferris and Corinne were all being so careful about it, went back much further than a single land vote next week. It went back generations. And somewhere inside that long, patient pattern, her own family's story was tangled up too. She just didn't know yet exactly how. 6 days before the town council vote, the Iron Wolves showed up at the diner again. Not to cause trouble exactly, just to be present. 2 of them parked their bikes right outside the front window and sat their engines idling for nearly 20 minutes before finally riding off. It happened again the next day, and the day after that. Ferris noticed. Of course he noticed. He'd been running this business long enough to know intimidation when he saw it, even the quiet, patient kind that never quite crosses a legal line. "They're trying to scare off customers," he told Marlowe one evening, watching through the window as 2 more bikes rumbled past slow, unhurried. "Or scare me." "Why would they want to scare you?" Ferris hesitated. He'd been hesitating a lot lately, Marlowe realized. Same as Walt. Same as Corinne's shaking hands over a torn jacket collar. Everyone around her seemed to be holding half a sentence just behind their teeth. "There's a vote coming up," Ferris finally said. "About this land. about whether this whole block gets sold off to Richard Draven's company. Can they do that? Just take your diner? Not take it exactly. But they can rezone it. Force a sale at whatever price the town decides is fair. And when men like Richard Draven are involved, fair usually means whatever benefits Richard Draven. Marlo felt something tighten in her chest. That's not right. No, Ferris agreed. It's not. Isn't there anything you can do? Ferris was quiet for a long moment, wiping down the same section of counter he'd already wiped twice. There might be, he said finally. There's an old file. Records from a long time ago. Proof of how this whole deal got engineered in the first place, back before you were even born. If I could find it, it might be enough to stop the vote. Where is it? I don't know, he admitted. I only know it exists because somebody told me a long time ago to keep it safe if I ever found it. I never did find it. Who told you that? Ferris looked at her for a long moment. Something old and sad passed behind his eyes. A friend, he said simply. A good one. Gone a long time now, as far as this town's concerned. He didn't say more. Marlo didn't push. She was learning more and more that this town was full of doors closed, gently kept shut out of love, rather than secrecy for its own sake. She was starting to feel more each day, like she was standing right in the middle of a story that had started long before she was born, and she was only now catching up to the parts that involved her directly. That feeling only grew stronger 3 nights later. It was closing time. Rain again, lighter this time, more mist than storm. Marlo was locking up the back door of the diner, trash bags in each hand, headed for the dumpster at the edge of the gravel lot. She didn't hear the motorcycle approach until it was already idling 20 feet behind her. She turned. Cole Draven sat astride his bike helmet off, watching her. Alone this time. No crew behind him. Her whole body went still, calm, settling over her, the way a held breath settles before you decide whether to run or stand your ground. What do you want? She said. Just talking. You don't talk. You grab things and hit people. Something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt. Something close to it, though. I'm not here to hurt you, he said. Forgive me if I don't take your word for it. He was quiet a moment, engine ticking as it cooled behind him. You didn't report me, he said finally. To the cops. Why? Marlo studied him for a long moment before answering. Would it have mattered if I did? Cole didn't answer that, which was its own kind of answer. My father wants me watching this diner, he said instead, surprising her with the honesty of it. Watching your boss. Making sure nobody digs up old paperwork before some vote next week. Marlo's pulse quickened, though she kept her face perfectly still. What paperwork? I don't know. He wouldn't say. Just told me to keep an eye on things. Keep people from causing trouble. And hitting me. Was that also just business? Cole's jaw tightened. That was a mistake, he said quietly, almost too quiet to hear over the rain. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was closer to one than Marlo expected from a man who had slapped her hard enough to leave a bruise that lasted 5 days. She said nothing, just watched him weighing something in her mind. You should tell your boss, Cole said finally. To be careful. My father doesn't like being told no, and he's got more patience than people give him credit for. He'll wait as long as it takes to get what he wants. Why are you telling me this? Cole looked away, out toward the wet, dark fields beyond the lot, and for just a moment, something almost human crossed his face. Something tired, something conflicted. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe because you didn't scream when I hit you. Maybe because that stuck with me more than I want it to. He put his helmet back on before she could answer, kicked his bike to life, and rode off into the rain without another word. Marlo stood alone in the gravel lot for a long moment, trash bags forgotten at her feet, replaying every word. Somewhere out past the edge of that quiet moment, a much bigger storm was gathering. She could feel it the way you feel weather changing before the sky itself gives any sign. 9 days had already dropped to 6. And somewhere, in a locked box in a house she'd never once visited, an old file sat waiting to be found. A file that would explain everything. The land, the vote, her mother, the torn jacket collar, the shield hidden in her nightstand drawer. All of it connected. All of it waiting. She didn't know that yet. Not fully. But standing there in the rain, trash bags dripping at her sides, engine sound fading into the dark, Marlo Ashwood felt, for the first time in her life, the shape of a truth just beginning to surface. Something her uncle had carried alone for 15 years. Something a woman in a lavender cardigan had been carrying even longer. Something this whole town, in its own guilty way, had been carrying together without ever quite admitting it out loud. Some nights a small town tells you everything you need to know about it. You just have to be patient enough to listen. And Marlo, more than anyone, had learned exactly how to be patient. She just didn't know yet that her patience was about to run out. If there's one thing this story wants you to sit with before we move any further, it's this. Respect isn't something you earn only from people who already like you. It's something you offer freely to a delivery driver in the rain, to an old farmer at a diner counter, to a woman in a corner booth who never says much. The measure of a person isn't how they treat someone who can do something for them. It's how they treat someone they think they'll never need again. Cole Draven had a lot to learn about that. He was about to learn it the hard way. But so, in a gentler and much older way, was Marlo. She was about to learn that some of the people she'd spent her whole life quietly caring for had been carrying her too, in ways she never once suspected. A jacket sewn shut by her own hands over a tear that had been waiting 15 years to be explained. A shield hidden in a nightstand drawer, warm from her palm, cold with a truth not yet spoken aloud. An uncle who taught her to fall properly long before either of them understood exactly what she'd need to fall from. 6 days remained until the vote that would decide the fate of Ferris's diner. And though nobody in this story knew it yet, the fate of a good deal more than that. Somewhere in a warehouse past the fairgrounds, old paperwork waited in the dark. Somewhere in a lavender cardigan, a mother waited in plain sight. And somewhere on a wet gravel road, a young man on a motorcycle was starting just barely to wonder if the job his father gave him was one he still wanted to finish. The rain would keep falling on this town a little while longer. But even rain eventually clears. If you've made it this far into the story, maybe you already sense what kind of town this really is underneath the rain and the motorcycles and the trouble brewing on Main Street. It's the kind of town where an old farmer notices a bruise before anyone points it out to him, where a diner owner keeps a promise for 15 years without ever fully understanding what he's protecting, where a woman in a corner booth watches a stranger's jacket collar and has to grip her own coffee cup to keep her hands from shaking. It's easy to assume a small town like this one is simple. Easy to assume the people in it are exactly what they appear to be, no more and no less. Marlo was learning day by day just how wrong that assumption could be. Everyone around her, it seemed, was carrying something. A memory. A promise. A grief nobody had ever properly named out loud. And somewhere underneath all of it, quiet and patient, waited a truth 15 years in the making, gathering itself slowly toward the moment it would finally have no choice but to surface. That moment was coming. 6 days away and closing fast. 6 days left until the vote. That's how this next part of the story starts. A number ticking down quiet and steady, the way a clock ticks in a house where everyone's pretending not to notice it. Marlo didn't talk about the vote much that week. Not out loud. But it sat behind everything she did the way a held breath sits behind a person's chest right before they say something they've been putting off for years. She kept working her shifts, kept going to class, kept sitting across the kitchen table from Walt. Every evening, books, open coffee going cold, both of them quieter than usual. But something in her had changed since the night in the rain. She was paying attention now. Really paying attention. Not just to the obvious things, the bikes idling outside the diner window. The careful looks passed between grown adults who thought she wasn't watching. She was paying attention to herself too. That was the part that unsettled her most. Take Tuesday afternoon, for example. A delivery order got mixed up, two customers arguing over whose soup was whose voices rising fast in the middle of a crowded diner. Marlo didn't think. She just moved. Stepped between them, calm, steady voice, low and even. Let's sort this out together. Nobody's soup is going cold while we figure it out. The tension broke almost instantly. Both customers laughed, a little embarrassed, and the moment passed. Ferris, watching from behind the counter, raised an eyebrow at her. Where'd you learn to do that? Do what? Talk a room down like that. Most 19-year-olds I know would have just stood there. Marlo opened her mouth to answer and realized halfway through forming the sentence that she didn't actually have one. She didn't know where she'd learned it. It had simply been there, waiting the way muscle memory waits. In a body that's practiced something so many times, it forgets it ever had to learn it at all. I don't know, she admitted. It just felt like the right thing to say. Ferris studied her a moment longer than the conversation really called for. Your mother used to do that, he said almost to himself. Marlo's whole body went still. You knew my mother. Ferris's face did something complicated. Caught between two different kinds of loyalty, the way a man's face does when he's about to say more than he planned to. I knew her, he said carefully. A long time ago. Before you were born, mostly. What was she like? He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes softened. She was exactly like you, he said. Steady when everybody else in the room was falling apart. People underestimated her for it. That turned out to be their mistake more often than not. He wouldn't say more that day. Marlo didn't push. She was starting to understand something about this town and about the people in it who'd loved her mother. They weren't hiding the truth to protect themselves. They were hiding it to protect her. That kind of love, she thought, standing there with an empty coffee pot in her hand, was a heavier thing to carry than most people realized. The following morning, before her shift, Marlo went back to the county records office. Doris was behind the counter again, glasses pushed up into her gray hair, sorting a stack of forms. Back again, Doris said, not unkindly. I need to know how to request access to the storage warehouse, Marlo said. The one you mentioned, where the old files got moved after the flood. Doris studied her for a moment. That takes a signature from the council clerk, she said, and a reason on file. What exactly are you looking for, hon? Marlo hesitated. She thought about how careful everyone around her had been lately, how many half-sentences had trailed off into silence whenever the land vote came up. I think there are records in there, she said slowly, that might show how certain land purchases got approved over the years. Records somebody doesn't want found before next week's vote. Doris's expression didn't change much, but something in her eyes sharpened. You're Renata's girl, she said. It wasn't a question. Marlo's breath caught. You knew her too. Everybody who's lived here more than 20 years knew her, Doris said. Good woman. Asked too many questions for her own good, some folks said. I never thought that was a fair way to put it. She pulled a form out from beneath the counter, set it in front of Marlo, and tapped it twice with one finger. I can't sign off on this myself, she said. But I can tell you the council clerk's assistant owes me a favor from about 15 years back. Come by Thursday morning. I'll see what I can arrange. Thank you, Doris. Don't thank me yet, Doris said, lowering her voice. Whatever's in those boxes, somebody clearly doesn't want anybody finding it. You be careful poking around it. Your mother was careful too, and it wasn't quite careful enough. Marlo carried that warning with her the rest of the day, turning it over in her mind the way she'd been turning over the name Renata for days now. 2 days later, on a slow Thursday afternoon, Corinne came in for her usual order. Black coffee, wheat toast, a small side of fruit. Marlo brought the coffee over herself this time, and instead of walking away right after she lingered. Can I ask you something? Marlo said. Corinne looked up, careful the way she always was. Of course. The other week you said something about my jacket. About it being old. Corinne's hand went very still around her coffee cup. I did. You looked like you recognized it. For a long moment, Corinne said nothing at all. The diner hummed on around them, forks against plates, the low murmur of other conversations, none of it touching the small space between the two of them. I knew someone once, Corinne said finally, voice barely above a whisper, who wore a jacket just like that. Who? Corinne's eyes glistened just slightly before she blinked it away. Her name was Renata. The name landed in Marlowe's chest like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading out slow in every direction. She'd never heard that name before, not once in 19 years. Walt had never spoken it. Ferris had never spoken it. But something in her, some old instinct she couldn't explain, recognized it anyway. The way you recognize the shape of a room you were only ever in as an infant, too young to remember consciously, but somehow your body remembers the doorway. Renata, Marlowe repeated slowly. Did you know her well? Corinne's hands trembled around the coffee cup. Better than most, she said. A long time ago. What happened to her? For a moment, Marlowe thought Corinne might actually answer. Really answer all the way right there in booth number 6 with the afternoon sun slanting gold through the window. But then the bell over the door jingled, a group of customers walked in, and Corinne's whole posture changed, folding back into that careful, invisible shape she wore most days. That's a conversation for another time, she said. I'm sorry. Please, Marlowe said, and there was something almost desperate in it now, some door inside her cracking open faster than she could control. Everyone keeps saying that. Another time. When is it going to be the right time? Corinne reached out, surprising them both, and took Marlowe's hand gently in her own. Sooner than you think, she said. I promise you that. But not today. Today isn't safe yet. Safe for who? Corinne's eyes met hers, steady despite the tremor still in her hands. For both of us. She left a generous tip that afternoon, same as always lately, and drove away slow the way a person drives when their mind is somewhere far behind them, instead of on the road ahead. Marlowe stood at the window and watched her go, one word echoing through her chest over and over. Renata. That evening, she brought the name home with her the way you bring home a stone you found somewhere unexpected, turning it over in your pocket the whole walk back. Walt was in his recliner when she got in, same as always, the television murmuring low. Uncle Walt? Something in her voice made him look up right away. What is it? Who is Renata? The mug in his hand slipped just slightly, coffee sloshing over the rim onto his fingers. He set it down fast, too fast, on the side table. Where did you hear that name? Corinne said it, at the diner. She said she knew a woman named Renata who wore a jacket like mine. Walt sat very still for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice came out rough, older than she'd ever heard it. Your mother's name, he said, was Renata. The room went very quiet. Marlowe had spent 15 years without a single name for the woman who was supposed to have raised her. Just an absence. A shape cut out of every family photograph, every story Walt almost told and then didn't. Now suddenly she had a name. Renata. Why didn't you ever tell me? Walt's eyes were wet, though he was working hard not to let it show. Because saying her name out loud in this town, he said slowly, was never as simple as it should have been, not for a long time. What does that mean? It means, he said, choosing each word like it cost him something, that there are people in this town who would very much like everyone to forget that name ever existed. And I promised your mother a long time ago that I would keep you safe from those people until you were old enough and strong enough to face them on your own terms. I'm 19, Uncle Walt. I think I've been strong enough for a while now. He looked at her for a long moment, something like pride and something like fear both moving across his weathered face at once. I'm starting to think you're right, he said. I just wish I'd realized it sooner. He didn't say more that night, but something had shifted the way it had the week before. A little more light finding its way through a door that had been closed a very long time. Marlo went to bed that night with a name in her chest instead of just a silence. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she slept soundly straight through until morning. Meanwhile, across town, Cole Draven was not sleeping well at all. He'd taken to riding out past the edge of town most nights alone, the wind loud enough in his helmet to drown out his own thoughts for a while. It wasn't working lately. The delivery girl kept surfacing in his mind at odd hours. The way she hadn't flinched. The way she'd told him flat out that he'd knocked something out of his own jacket worth more than he'd ever understand. He didn't know what she'd meant by that. But it bothered him more than he wanted to admit, the way a splinter bothers you long after you've stopped noticing exactly where it went in. His father had told him to leave her alone. For now, Cole intended to, mostly. 2 nights before the incident in the parking lot, Cole sat across the dinner table from his father, neither of them eating much. His mother had passed years ago, and the two of them rarely shared a meal anymore, unless business demanded it. "The vote is in 5 days," Richard said, not looking up from his plate. "I need this handled cleanly. No more incidents." "There won't be," Cole said. "There'd better not be. I've spent 2 years building the votes I need on that council. One bad headline, and men who've already shaken my hand start finding reasons to change their minds." "Why does it matter so much to you?" Cole asked, surprising himself with the question. "It's 1 block. You already own half this town." Richard set down his fork slow and deliberate. "You don't understand what that block means." He said something cold sliding into his voice. "You've never had to. That's the whole point of everything I've built. So you'd never have to understand it." "Then explain it to me." Richard studied his son for a long moment, something almost like exhaustion crossing his face. "Some debts for them bum," he said finally. "Don't show up on any paperwork you'd know how to read. Leave it at that." Cole wanted to press further, but he recognized the particular stillness in his father's face, the one that meant the conversation was over whether Cole liked it or not. He left the table more unsettled than he'd arrived, the way he'd been feeling more and more often lately, like a man standing on ground. He was only now realizing had never been entirely solid. He thought driving home that night about how little he actually knew of his father's life before the Draven name meant anything in this town. Richard rarely spoke of his own father, a man who'd died when Cole was still a boy, remembered mostly through a handful of old photographs and a reputation for being exactly as hard to read as Richard himself had become. Maybe that was where it started, Cole thought. Maybe secrets got passed down the same way land did. Quietly, deliberately. Nobody ever quite explaining where the boundary lines had first been drawn or why. The next night, sitting in a bar on the edge of town, with 2 of his crew half a beer in and restless, he made a decision he would spend a long time regretting. "We should send a message," said Denny, one of the younger Iron Wolves, barely into his 20s and still young enough to idolize Cole more than was probably healthy for either of them. "That diner's been giving Draven land trouble for months. Somebody should remind them who they're dealing with." "My father said leave it alone," Cole said, though his heart wasn't really in the objection. "Your father's not here." Cole looked at his beer for a long moment. Thought about the vote 5 days out. Thought about the pressure his father kept putting on him, thinly veiled as fatherly disappointment, the same pressure Cole had spent his whole adult life trying to outrun by proving himself useful in exactly the way his father wanted. "Just a message," Cole said finally. "Nothing more. We scare her a little. Make sure she knows not to go poking around where she doesn't belong." It was in hindsight the worst decision he'd make in this entire story. He just didn't know that yet. The night after that, Marlo finished her closing shift a little after 10. Ferris had already gone home trusting her with the last lockup, same as he had 100 times before. She walked out into a clear, cold night breath, fogging in front of her keys, jingling in one hand as she headed for her scooter parked at the edge of the gravel lot. She heard the engines before she saw them. 3 motorcycles' headlights, cutting through the dark, rolling slow into the lot and fanning out in a loose half-circle around her. Cole was in front. Denny and one other rider flanked him on either side. Marlowe's whole body went still, the same steady stillness that had carried her through the night in the rain. "Evening," Cole said, killing his engine. The others followed suit, the sudden silence somehow louder than the engines had been. "You need something," Marlowe said. Not a question, flat, even careful. "Just making sure you understand something," Cole said, swinging off his bike, taking a slow step toward her. "This town's about to change. Smart people know when to stop asking questions and just let it happen. I haven't asked anybody a single question you'd need to worry about." "You've been at the records office," Denny said, stepping up beside Cole, grinning in a way that had nothing friendly in it. "Doris talks. Small town." Marlowe's pulse quickened, though her face stayed calm. "I'm allowed to read public records." "Sure you are," Cole said. "But maybe you should think real hard about whether it's worth it. Your boss's little diner, your own future around here. Some things aren't worth digging up." He took another step closer. Close enough now that she could see clear in the moonlight that whatever guilt had flickered across his face after the first slap hadn't fully taken root. Not yet. Not enough to stop him from doing this. "Get on your bike and go home," Marlowe said. "This isn't going to end the way you think it is." Cole laughed, short and humorless. Big talk for someone standing alone in a parking lot. He reached for her arm. What happened next took less than 4 seconds, though it would feel to everyone who eventually heard about it like it had unfolded slowly enough to study frame by frame. The moment his hand closed around her wrist, Marlowe's body moved before her mind fully caught up with it. A quarter turn of her hips. A drop of her weight, low and centered. Her free hand came up and caught the inside of his elbow, redirecting his own momentum instead of fighting against it. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't even really an attack. It was physics. Angles. Leverage learned so young and so thoroughly that her body simply remembered it the way it remembers how to catch itself on a staircase before conscious thought ever gets involved. Cole's balance broke completely. He stumbled sideways, boots tangling with the kickstand of his own bike, and the whole machine went down with him. 400 pounds of steel toppling sideways in the gravel lot with a crash loud enough to echo off the diner's brick wall. He hit the ground hard, half-pinned beneath his own front wheel. Breath knocked clean out of him, one leg twisted awkwardly under the frame. For a moment, nobody moved. Denny and the third rider stood frozen, staring down at their leader curled on the wet gravel, groaning, struggling weakly against the weight of his own motorcycle. Marlowe stood exactly where she'd started breathing. Steady hands loose at her sides, looking down at Cole with an expression that held no triumph in it at all. Only a kind of tired sadness. "I told you," she said, "not to grab me." Cole's face twisted in pain, and humiliation stared up at her from the ground. "You broke my leg," he gasped. "You'll live," Marlowe said, though not unkindly. "Might want to think about that next time you decide to scare somebody in a parking lot." She turned to walk toward her scooter. That's when the second set of headlights swept into the lot. A car this time, not a motorcycle. Sleek, expensive, out of place against the gravel and rust of the parking lot. It rolled to a stop a few yards away, and the driver's door opened. Richard Draven stepped out. He'd been driving to a late meeting when he got the call from Denny, panicked, half incoherent, saying something about Cole being hurt at the diner. He crossed the lot, fast eyes scanning the scene. His son on the ground, tangled beneath his own bike. 2 of his crew standing useless and shaken nearby. And Marlowe standing calm at the edge of it all, watching him arrive. Richard's eyes landed on her face. And something happened that nobody in that parking lot expected. Not Cole groaning on the ground. Not Denny staring wide-eyed. Not even Marlowe herself. Richard Draven froze completely. The color drained slowly out of his face. His mouth opened slightly, no words coming out at first, his eyes moving over Marlowe's features one at a time, like a man reading a document he'd hoped never to see again. "It can't be," he said so quietly. Marlowe almost didn't catch it. "Excuse me." Richard blinked, seemed to catch himself, and the mask of a powerful, controlled businessman slid back over his face almost as fast as it had slipped. But not fast enough. Marlowe had seen it. That flicker of something that looked more than anything else like fear. "You look," Richard said slowly, carefully, "like someone I used to know." "I get that a lot lately," Marlowe said evenly, watching him with the same steady attention she'd once turned on his son. Richard's eyes flicked down to Cole, still tangled beneath the fallen bike. "Get up," he snapped, some of the old control returning to his voice. Cole struggled upright, wincing, favoring one leg, Denny rushing to help him. Richard turned back to Marlowe. Whatever had cracked open in his expression a moment ago was sealed shut again, now replaced by something colder. "You should be more careful," he said. "Accidents happen to people who go looking for trouble." "He grabbed me first," Marlowe said. "There are witnesses." "Are there?" Richard said, voice flat, almost bored, though his eyes were anything but. "We'll see how that holds up." He helped his limping son toward the car, without another word. Denny and the third rider trailing behind, gathering up the fallen motorcycle between them. Before he climbed back into the driver's seat, Richard paused, looking back at Marlowe one last time across the gravel lot. "What's your name?" he asked, voice low. "Marlowe?" Something flickered again behind his eyes. Not recognition exactly. Something closer to dread. "Marlowe," he repeated softly, almost to himself, and then got in the car and drove away without another word. Marlowe stood alone in the lot for a long time after the taillights disappeared, replaying that look on his face, over and over. It hadn't been the look of a man confused by a stranger. It had been the look of a man seeing a ghost. Across town that same night, Cole sat on the edge of his bed, ankle-wrapped tight ice pack going warm against his shin, replaying his own version of the same 4 seconds. He'd expected to feel angry, humiliated at the very least. Instead, mostly he felt confused. He'd grabbed plenty of people before, shoved plenty of people before in bars and arguments that never should have escalated as far as they did. Nobody had ever put him on the ground like that, certainly not without throwing a single punch. Denny called around midnight, voice low, clearly rattled. "You good, man? I'll live. That was insane. She just moved and you were down. Didn't even look like she tried hard." "I noticed," Cole said dryly. There was a pause on the line. "You think your dad's gonna be mad?" Cole closed his eyes. Thought about the look on his father's face in that parking lot, something he'd never once seen there before in 27 years. Not anger, not disappointment, fear. His father didn't get afraid. Not of anything. Certainly not of a 19-year-old delivery driver with a torn jacket collar and steady hands. "Yeah," Cole said slowly. "I think he's gonna be something." He didn't sleep that night either, staring at the ceiling, turning over a question he couldn't quite make sense of yet. What had his father seen in that girl's face that scared him so badly? By the next afternoon, word of what happened had spread through town, the way word always did, faster and messier with every retelling. Some versions had Marlowe attacking first. Some had Cole falling off his bike on his own, too drunk to keep his balance. A few, closer to the truth than anyone realized, simply said a girl who worked at the diner had put one of the Draven boys flat on the ground without breaking a sweat. Cole heard most of the versions secondhand, laid up at home with his leg propped on a pillow. His father's silence about the whole matter somehow louder than any lecture would have been. 2 days later, sitting alone in his room, restless and sore, Cole found himself pulling up an old link on his phone. Someone in a town Facebook group had posted a short clip weeks earlier, pulled from the security camera above the shuttered auto shop part of a joke post about small-town nightlife that had gathered a few dozen comments and then been mostly forgotten. Near the very end of the clip, it caught 2 seconds of a rainy night outside the diner. He watched it 3 times. Watched himself grab a stranger's delivery bag. Watched himself hit a girl who never once raised her hands against him. Watched in the very last frame before the video cut off something small and metal glinting on the wet pavement, before she scooped it up fast and tucked it away. He didn't know what it was. But something about it nagged at him, the same way his father's fear had nagged at him in that parking lot, a loose thread he couldn't quite stop pulling at, even though some deep, uneasy part of him suspected he wasn't going to like what unraveled once he did. That doubt would matter later. For now, let's rewind a little back to the same night. Everything went down in the gravel lot, and follow what happened to Marlowe once the taillights disappeared. An hour after Richard Draven drove away, a patrol car rolled slowly into the gravel lot, lights off, responding to a call about a disturbance. A young officer named Reyes climbed out, notepad in hand, clearly more accustomed to writing up parking complaints than anything like this. "You're the one who called it in?" he asked, looking at Marlowe. "I did, she said, after they left. Wanted it on record." He glanced at his notes. "Got a report of an altercation. Motorcycle down, injury to a Cole Draven." "He grabbed my wrist first," Marlowe said, calm and clear. "I used a defensive release. He lost his balance and his bike went down on top of him. I never threw a punch, never made first contact of any kind. There's a difference between self-defense and assault, officer. And I'd appreciate if the report reflected that difference accurately." Reyes looked up from his notepad, mildly surprised at the precision of it. "You a law student or something?" "Criminal justice major, first year." "Explains the vocabulary." He almost smiled. "Any witnesses besides the men involved?" "Just them. It happened fast." He nodded slowly, jotting a few more lines. "I'll note your statement. For what it's worth, doesn't look to me like you're the one who started anything out here. But I'll be honest with you, this town, this family, things have a way of getting complicated fast when the Draven name shows up in a report." "I appreciate the honesty," Marlowe said. He tore off a small carbon copy and handed it to her. "Keep this. Case numbers on top. If anybody comes at you with a different version of tonight, you've got your own statement on file, time-stamped, filed before theirs." It was a small kindness, offered quietly. The kind Marlowe was starting to notice happened more often in this town than she'd ever given it credit for. She thanked him, folded the paper carefully into her jacket pocket, next to the small metal shield still resting where she'd hidden it weeks ago. She would be grateful for that folded paper sooner than she expected. The next morning, everything moved faster than she expected. By 9 a.m., a story was already circulating around town. Not the true one, a different one entirely. Polished and packaged and delivered with unusual speed for a small-town rumor mill, which made Marlowe suspicious of exactly how it had spread so fast. The version going around said Marlowe Ashwood had attacked Cole Draven, unprovoked, breaking his leg in a parking lot altercation. That poor Cole, son of one of the town's most respected businessmen, had simply been trying to have a conversation when the delivery girl turned violent. By that afternoon, a man in a gray suit showed up at the diner, introducing himself as a representative of Draven Property Holdings, asking to speak with Ferris privately in the back office. Marlowe waited outside, heart-hammering, catching only fragments of the conversation through the thin wall. Liability? Assault charges. Best for everyone if she's no longer employed here. The sale agreement could still be expedited if certain complications were resolved quickly. When Ferris came out 20 minutes later, his face had gone gray, older somehow than it had looked that morning. "Marlowe?" "I heard some of it," she said. "I'm sorry, I never meant to put you in this position." "You didn't put me anywhere," Ferris said firmly. "He grabbed you. You defended yourself. That's not a crime, whatever story they're telling. But it's causing you trouble anyway." Ferris was quiet for a long moment. "They want me to let you go," he admitted finally. "Say it'll make the whole assault complaint disappear quietly, and maybe soften the terms on the land deal too." Marlowe felt her stomach drop. "Then you should let me go," she said. "You can't lose this place over me, Marlowe. I mean it, Mr. Ferris. This diner is everything you've built your whole life. I won't be the reason you lose it." Ferris looked at her for a long, heavy moment. Something fierce and sad, both moving behind his tired eyes. "Your mother made me an offer just like that once," he said. "Told me not to risk anything on her account. I didn't listen to her then. and I lost her anyway." "What do you mean?" He shook his head slowly, not ready even now to say the whole truth out loud. "What I mean," he said instead, "is that I already lost something precious once by staying quiet when I shouldn't have. I don't intend to make that mistake twice." He didn't fire her on the spot. He told her to go home, take the rest of the evening, let him think it over. But by the end of that same day, under mounting pressure, neither of them fully understood the source of and facing a formal complaint that threatened his business license directly. Ferris called her and told her, voice heavy with apology, that he had no choice left. He was letting her go. Gently. With her final paycheck padded generously beyond what he owed her, and a promise quiet and firm that this wasn't the end of anything. Marlo drove back to the diner one last time that night, just to clear out her locker, the parking lot lights humming overhead, the same gravel crunching under her boots, where only days before she'd left a grown man curled beneath his own motorcycle. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt exhausted and unmoored, and further than ever from understanding the shape of the truth everyone around her kept almost telling her. She hadn't made it halfway across the lot before a familiar truck pulled in, headlights washing over her, and Harold climbed out, moving slower than he used to, cap in hand. "Heard what happened," he said, not bothering with small talk. "Whole diner's talking about it. Half of them got it backwards." "It's fine, Mr. Harold." "It is not fine," he said more sharply than she'd ever heard him speak. "A young woman defends herself from a man twice her size grabbing her in a parking lot, and somehow she's the one who loses her job over it. That's not fine. That's just easier for some folks to swallow than the truth." Marlo managed a tired smile. "Doesn't change anything, though. Not tonight." Harold reached into his truck and pulled out a folded $20 bill, pressing it into her hand before she could protest. "That's not charity," he said gruffly, cutting off her objection before it started. "That's 50 years of buying pie from Ferris and never once getting shortchanged, and I intend to keep buying it from him a good while longer. You tell him I said so, and you tell him I'll be at that council meeting Thursday, sitting right up front if it comes down to a vote." "You don't have to do that." "No," Harold agreed. "I don't. That's exactly why I'm going to." He climbed back into his truck, waved once, and pulled out of the lot, taillights fading down the dark road. Marlo stood there a long moment, the folded 20 warm in her palm, thinking about what Ferris had said days earlier about how much memory this town kept stored up in quiet, ordinary places. A wall of old photographs. A regular's loyalty to a pie recipe. An old farmer showing up in a parking lot at 9 at night because a girl he barely knew had been treated unfairly. It wasn't much against the size of what the Draven family controlled. But it was something. And in a week that had taken so much from her, something mattered more than it might have any other week of her life. That same night, in a small storage unit on the edge of town, quietly pointed out to Ferris weeks earlier by an old friend who never explained how she knew about it. The single box of old paperwork he'd been trying to track down for years. The file he'd hinted at weeks earlier, the one he believed might finally prove exactly how the Draven family had engineered decades of land deals in their own favor, was broken into and emptied out completely. Nothing left behind but an empty cardboard box and a padlock cut clean through with bolt cutters. Ferris had only just started renting that unit 2 days earlier, moving the box there himself. The moment he finally located it, never once realizing the space had a history of its own that stretched back well before he'd ever signed the paperwork for it. Only 2 people in town knew that unit was in use at all. One of them was Ferris, and one of them, though nobody suspected it yet, was about to find herself accused of the theft. Marlo found out the next morning, not from Ferris, but from a phone call that woke her before sunrise. "They're saying you did it," Walt told her, standing in the kitchen doorway, phone still in his hand, his face pale in the gray, early light. That was Ferris on the phone. "Somebody broke into a storage unit last night. Cut the lock clean off. Emptied out a box of old files he'd been trying to track down for years." Marlo sat up fast, heart hammering. "Why would anybody think it was me? I didn't even know that unit existed." "Somebody tipped off the sheriff's office," Walt said grimly. "Said they saw your scooter parked near there last night. Around the same time, the lock got cut. That's not possible. I was here all night after I left the diner. I know that, Walt said. You know that. But it's your word against whoever made that call, and right now, this town's got a lot of reasons to believe the worst about you all, planted real careful one right after another over the last 2 weeks. Marlo sat on the edge of her bed, the folded carbon copy from Officer Reyes, still tucked in her jacket pocket where she'd left it, one small piece of paper standing between her and a story that seemed determined to swallow her whole. She thought about the parking lot, about the assault complaint that wasn't true, about losing her job at a diner that had never once made her feel unwelcome, right up until powerful people decided her presence there was inconvenient. And now, this. A theft she had nothing to do with, timed perfectly to strip away the one piece of evidence that might have stopped the vote entirely. Somebody's building a case against me, she said slowly, thinking out loud now the criminal justice classes she'd been taking, suddenly feeling less like theory and more like something she needed urgently. Piece by piece. First the assault story, now this. By the time the vote happens tomorrow, nobody credible is going to want to stand anywhere near me, let alone believe anything I say about that land. Walt sat down heavily across from her, his own face lined with worry he wasn't bothering to hide anymore. Your mother went through something like this, he said, right before she disappeared. Story after story, each one a little worse than the last, until half this town looked at her like she was the problem instead of the people she was trying to expose. Marlo went very still. You're saying this has happened before? I'm saying, Walt said, voice heavy, that history in this town has an ugly habit of repeating itself when the same family keeps writing the story. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Outside, the sun was coming up slow and gray over the fields, another ordinary morning dressed up around a town that was anything but ordinary underneath. Marlo thought about Corinne's trembling hands around a coffee cup, about Ferris's careful half-finished sentences, about the shield in her nightstand drawer and the name Renata sitting new and unfamiliar in her chest, like a word in a language she was only just beginning to learn. Somewhere out there, whoever had cut that lock and emptied that box believed they'd just won, believed they'd erased the last piece of proof standing between Richard Draven and everything he wanted. They didn't know Marlo yet, not really. They didn't know that a person raised on patience doesn't stop looking for the truth just because someone hides it a little deeper. If anything, it only slows her down. It never stops her. I want to see that storage unit, she said. Marlo, I need to see it, Uncle Walt. If I'm going to be accused of this, I want to understand exactly what was taken and exactly who knew where to find it. Walt studied her for a long moment, something resolving behind his tired eyes. Then I'm coming with you, he said. You're not walking into whatever this is alone, not anymore. I've let you carry too much of this by yourself already. It was in its own quiet way the first time in 15 years that Walt Ashwood had chosen to step directly into the fight he'd spent so long trying to shield his niece from entirely. They didn't leave for the storage unit that morning, not right away. Instead, Walt made coffee strong and dark, and the two of them sat at the kitchen table a while longer, going over everything they knew so far, laying it out piece by piece, like puzzle edges finally starting to find each other. The old jacket. The torn collar Corinne had recognized at a glance. The name Renata spoken out loud for the first time in 15 years. The pattern of Draven land purchases stretching back 3 generations. The parking lot and the look of dread on Richard Draven's face. The stolen file timed with almost surgical precision, one single day before the vote that would decide the fate of an entire block of Main Street. None of this is random, Marlo said, turning her coffee mug slowly between her palms. Somebody's been managing this for a long time, managing me even without me realizing it. Managing all of us, Walt said, longer than you know. Then it's time somebody stopped letting them. Walt looked at his niece across the table, this young woman he'd raised from a scared 4-year-old into someone steady enough to stand her ground in a gravel lot against a man twice her size, and felt something shift quietly inside his chest. Not quite relief. Something closer to readiness. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said. "I hope you know that. Whatever else happens tomorrow." Marlo reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I'm starting to understand," she said, "that she's the reason I already know how to do most of what this week has asked of me." Neither of them said it out loud, but both of them understood, sitting there in the gray early light, with 2 mugs of coffee going cold between them, that whatever came next would ask even more. 6 days had become 1. The vote was tomorrow. And somewhere in this quiet, aching town, the truth that had waited 15 years to surface was about to run out of places left to hide. If you've stayed with this story this far, maybe you've noticed something underneath all of it. A pattern this town keeps circling back to, whether it wants to admit it or not. Power left unchecked long enough always starts to believe it's untouchable. It convinces itself that quiet people won't ever speak up, that old files can simply disappear, that a girl delivering soup in the rain has no history worth worrying about, no roots worth digging up, no strength worth respecting. That kind of thinking has a way of catching up with people eventually. Sometimes it takes 15 years. Sometimes it takes 1 long, difficult week. Either way, it comes. And when it finally does, it rarely announces itself the way people expect. No sudden thunderclap, no single dramatic moment that changes everything all at once. Just an old farmer showing up in a parking lot with a folded 20 and a promise to sit up front. A records clerk risking a small favor 15 years overdue. A woman in a lavender cardigan watching from a corner booth, gathering her courage 1 Thursday at a time. An uncle finally choosing to stand beside his niece instead of only behind her. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of things easy to overlook if you're only watching for fireworks. But stack enough of them together and they become something powerful people forget to plan for. They become a town remembering how to stand up straight. Marlo didn't sleep much that night, sitting up at the kitchen table long after Walt had finally gone to bed, going over every scrap of what they knew one more time by lamplight. Tomorrow the vote would happen with or without her. She intended to make sure it happened with everything she had. The vote was tomorrow. That single fact sat over the whole town that morning, like weather nobody could outrun. Marlo and Walt drove out to the storage facility just after 8, the sky still gray mist hanging low over the fields on either side of the road. The facility itself was small, a row of metal doors along a gravel drive, most of them rusted at the hinges, half forgotten by everyone except the people still paying rent on whatever they'd tucked away inside. Unit 14 sat at the far end door, hanging open, padlock cut clean through and left dangling from the latch like a broken tooth. Marlo stepped inside first. Empty. Just a stack of flattened cardboard, a thin layer of dust disturbed in careful, deliberate patterns. Whoever did this, she said, crouching down, studying the marks on the concrete floor, knew exactly what they were looking for. No wasted movement. No mess. "You sound like you've studied crime scenes before," Walt said. "I've read about them. Never stood in the middle of one that mattered this much." She ran her fingers along the inside edge of the door frame and stopped. Scratched faintly into the metal low near the floor, barely visible, unless you were looking for it, were 4 small letters. R-E-N. Marlo's breath caught. "Uncle Walt." He crouched down beside her, squinting at the mark. "That's not new," he said slowly. "Look how faded it is. That's been there years." "Ren," Marlo read aloud. "Like Renata." Walt's face went pale. "Ferris only started renting this place 2 days before the vote," he said, understanding arriving slow and heavy. "He never mentioned it had a history. I don't think he knew." They stood there a long moment, the mist outside curling low along the gravel drive, both of them turning the same thought over without saying it out loud. If Renata had once used this exact unit years ago, then whoever stole Ferris's box hadn't just been targeting old land paperwork. They'd been targeting a place with history, a place connected to her. which meant somebody out there still remembered exactly what Marlowe's mother had once tried to protect and exactly where she might have hidden proof of it. "We need to talk to Corinne," Marlowe said. "Today, before anything else." Walt hesitated, old caution still tugging at him even now. "Marlowe, Uncle Walt, please. I think she's been waiting 15 years for somebody to finally ask her the right question. I don't think we have the luxury of waiting any longer to ask it." He studied his niece for a long moment, then nodded slow and resigned, like a man finally stepping off a ledge he'd been standing on for a very long time. "All right," he said. "Let's go." Corinne lived on the quiet edge of town in a small house with a garden gone slightly wild roses, climbing untrimmed along a low fence. It was the kind of house that looked from the outside like it belonged to someone who had spent a long time trying very hard not to be noticed. She answered the door before they even knocked, as though she'd been watching the road all morning waiting. Her eyes went first to Marlowe's face, then to Walt's. Something in her expression broke open all at once, like a dam that had held for 15 years, finally giving way. "You found the storage unit," she said. It wasn't a question. "You knew about it," Marlowe said. "I rented it," Corinne said. "A long time ago, under a different name." She stepped back from the doorway, holding it open. "I think it's time you both came inside." The house smelled like lavender and old paper. Corinne led them into a small sitting room, curtains drawn against the gray morning light, and gestured for them to sit. She didn't sit herself, not right away. She stood by the window, arms wrapped around herself, gathering something inside her that had clearly taken 15 years to gather. "My name," she said finally, "was never Corinne." Marlowe's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. "I know," she whispered. Corinne turned to look at her, tears already gathering at the corners of her eyes. "You do Renata," Marlowe said. "You're Renata." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Corinne or Renata crossed the small room in 3 quick steps and pulled Marlowe into her arms, holding on the way. You hold on to something you were certain for 15 years you would never be allowed to hold again. "My girl," she whispered into Marlowe's hair, voice breaking completely now. "My beautiful, steady girl." Walt sat very still, watching his own eyes wet, a man finally releasing a weight he'd carried alone for far too long. It took a while before any of them could speak clearly again. Renata pulled back eventually, wiping her eyes, holding Marlowe's face gently in both hands, studying her the way a person studies something they'd only ever let themselves imagine. "You have your father's calm," she said, "and my stubbornness. God help this town." Marlowe laughed, a small wet sound caught somewhere between joy and disbelief. "Tell me what happened," she said. "All of it. Please. I need to understand." Renata sat down slowly across from her, folding her hands in her lap, the way a person sits when they're finally ready to set something down. "They've been carrying much too long. 15 years ago," she began, "I was a young attorney working out of a small office 2 doors down from where the pharmacy used to be. I handled property disputes mostly, small stuff. Will's boundary lines, the occasional eviction fight. And then an elderly farmer named Otis Bell came to my office," Renata continued, "convinced somebody had forged his signature on a land transfer he never agreed to. His property backed right up against Main Street. Prime land, if you knew how the town was likely to grow." "Richard Draven's land," Marlowe said slowly. Renata nodded. "I didn't believe it at first," she admitted. "Richard was already respected around here. Successful, generous, with donations to the right causes, careful about his public image. It seemed impossible a man like that would need to forge anything. But he had," Walt said. "It wasn't a question either." "He had was," Renata confirmed. "Not just with Otis Bell. Once I started looking, I found the same pattern going back years. Elderly landowners, people without family nearby to help them fight back people who trusted a handshake more than a lawyer. Richard's company would offer to help manage their paperwork during difficult times, medical bills, funeral arrangements, And somewhere in that paperwork, signatures would end up on documents the original owners never fully understood. That's fraud, Marlowe said, the criminal justice student, in her surfacing sharp and clear, even through the shock of everything else. That's elder exploitation on top of forgery. It was, Renata said. Richard was clever about it too. He never approached anyone directly. He used a small property management firm as a middleman, paid them well to stay quiet, and made sure his own name never appeared on the actual transfer documents themselves. Just on the purchase agreements afterward, once the land had already changed hands through the middleman. So on paper, Walt said slowly. It just looked like an ordinary business, buying up struggling farms. Exactly, Renata said. That's what made it so difficult to prove. I had to work backward, comparing dozens of handwriting samples, tracking down bank records, showing where the middleman's money actually originated. It took me almost 2 years of quiet work before I had enough to bring it to a judge with any real confidence. How many families, Marlowe asked. How many were there? 14 that I could confirm for certain, Renata said. Possibly more I never had time to fully investigate. Otis Bell, the Whitfield family out past the old mill. A widow named Constance Pruitt, who lost nearly 40 acres before anyone in her own family even realized what had happened. The weight of that number settled heavy over the small room. He found out I was investigating, she said. I never learned exactly how. Maybe someone at the courthouse mentioned my requests. Maybe he simply noticed a young attorney in town suddenly interested in decades-old property records. However it happened, he came to my office one evening, very calm, very controlled, and made it clear what would happen to the people I loved if I continued. He threatened you, Marlowe said, voice tight. He threatened you, Renata corrected gently. You were 4 years old. He never raised his voice, never said anything a recording could have used against him later. Just made it very clear that a young, single mother raising a daughter alone was, in his words, vulnerable in ways I might not have fully considered. The room went very quiet. I panicked, Renata continued. I'm not proud of that, but I did. I gathered everything I had, moved it somewhere I believed he'd never think to look. And I made the hardest decision of my life. I left you with Walt, told him only enough to keep you both safe, and I disappeared. Changed my name. Stayed close enough to watch you grow up from a careful distance, because leaving town entirely felt like abandoning you twice over. And I couldn't do that. Not really. Marlowe felt tears sliding down her own face now, unstoppable. 15 years, she whispered. You've been sitting in a diner booth, watching me grow up, and I never knew. I watched every single day I could, Renata said, voice breaking again. It was the closest thing to being your mother that Richard Draven left available to me. I am so sorry it wasn't enough. I am so sorry for every single day you grew up without knowing why. Marlowe reached across the space between them and took her mother's hands in her own. You kept me safe, she said. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually. Walt cleared his throat, wiping his own eyes with the back of one weathered hand. There's a vote tomorrow, he said gently, steering them back toward the urgency neither of them could afford to lose sight of. Renata, do you still have it? The case you built? Renata's expression shifted, something steadier settling over her grief. I never fully trusted that storage unit even under a false name, she said. Not once I understood exactly what Richard was capable of. I made a second copy years ago, and I've kept it somewhere he would never think to search. Where? Renata rose slowly, walked to an old bookshelf against the far wall, and pulled down a leather-bound book that looked at a glance like nothing more than a worn family Bible. She opened it carefully, revealing a hollowed-out interior, packed tight with folded documents, photographs, copies of forged signatures, beside originals for comparison. 15 years of proof, she said, setting it down on the table between them, waiting for the day it would finally be safe to use. Marlowe stared down at the documents, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the edge of the first page. Is it enough? She asked. Enough to stop the vote? It's more than enough to stop the vote, Renata said. Combined with what happened to you this past week, the assault Cole committed the theft last night clearly meant to bury exactly this kind of evidence. It's enough to end Richard Draven's career entirely. Walt looked between the two of them, something fierce and proud moving across his weathered face. Then we've got one night, he said, to get this in front of the right people before that vote happens tomorrow. Renata looked up, and for the first time since they'd walked through her door, something like hope broke clean across her tired face. Then let's not waste a single hour of it, she said. Before they got started, Marlowe reached into her jacket and drew out the small metal shield she'd carried hidden in her nightstand drawer for weeks, now setting it gently on the table beside the leather book. I've had this since the night Cole hit me, she said. It fell out of my jacket. I never understood why it was even in there. Renata's face softened at the sight of it, tears rising again. That belonged to your father, she said. Thomas served as a reserve officer here years before you were born. He gave it to me the week you were born, told me to keep it somewhere close to you always, as a kind of promise. I sewed it into the lining of that jacket myself. The same week I had to leave, so that some part of him and some part of me would still be near you, even after I couldn't be. Marlowe picked it up, turning it slowly in her palm, seeing it now for the first time as something more than a strange, tarnished mystery. It found its way out right when I needed it most, she said softly. Some things do that, Renata said, if you carry them long enough and honestly enough. They spent that afternoon and evening working together at Renata's kitchen table, the three of them organizing 15 years of carefully hidden proof into something a room full of skeptical council members could understand at a glance. Renata called an old colleague from her law school days, a man named Preston, who now practiced 2 counties over someone she trusted enough to walk through the legal weight of what they had. She put the call on speaker hands, still shaking slightly as she dialed a number she hadn't used in 15 years. Renata, Preston said, disbelief evident even through the phone's tinny speaker. I thought you were gone. I thought something terrible had happened to you. Something terrible almost did, Renata said. I need your help, Preston. Tomorrow morning, if you can manage it. She explained everything quickly, but thoroughly, the way a lawyer explains a case, even after 15 years away from a courtroom. Preston listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I remember the Otis Bell file, he said finally. You showed it to me once, before everything happened. I always wondered why you stopped pursuing it so suddenly. Now you know. I'll be there tomorrow, Preston said. First thing. And Renata, for what it's worth, I always believed you. I just didn't understand why you vanished so completely. I had a 4-year-old to protect, Renata said simply. It seemed like the only option I had left. After she hung up, the three of them sat quietly for a moment, the weight of the call settling over the room. That's one voice in the room tomorrow who'll take this seriously from the start, Walt said. We're going to need more than one. The county warehouse form Doris had offered to help arrange never ended up being necessary. Whatever the flood-damaged basement had been hiding for years, it couldn't compete with 15 years of proof kept safe in a book that looked like scripture. Marlowe, meanwhile, pulled her own folded police statement from her jacket pocket, the one Officer Reyes had handed her days earlier, and added it carefully to the growing stack. This proves the assault story was false, she said, time-stamped on record before their version ever got told. And this, Walt said, sliding across a printed page he'd pulled from his old truck's dashboard camera, a habit he'd kept for years after one too many close calls on icy roads. Shows Cole's motorcycle parked outside our house 3 separate nights last month, watching us, long before that parking lot. Piece by piece, the picture assembled itself. 15 years of quiet patience, one careful layer at a time, finally forming something too solid for anyone to talk their way around. Late that evening, as the three of them sat back for a rare, quiet moment, Renata reached into the leather book one more time and pulled out a small, faded photograph. She handed it to Marlowe without a word. It showed a young woman, unmistakably Renata, standing on the steps of the old courthouse, laughing at something out of frame. Beside her, one arm slung easily around her shoulders, stood a young man in uniform. National Guard patches visible on his sleeve, grinning the exact same tired, gentle grin Marlowe had grown up watching across 100 kitchen table conversations. "Uncle Walt," Marlowe said softly. "Your uncle protected both of us," Renata said. "Long before he ever had to protect just you. I don't think either of us would have made it through what came after without him." Walt looked away, embarrassed, blinking hard. "Somebody had to," he said gruffly. Marlowe held the photograph a long moment, tracing the edges of two people who had quietly shaped every steady, patient thing about her, long before she ever understood why. Then she set it down carefully and looked up at both of them. "Tomorrow," she said, "we finish this." Neither of them argued. Across town that same night, Cole Draven sat alone in his room. The grainy video still paused on his phone screen, the small metal glint frozen in the last frame. He'd spent 2 days turning that image over in his mind, unable to shake the sense that it mattered more than he understood. He thought back over the past few weeks, piecing together fragments he'd let slide past him at the time, without asking hard enough questions. His father's insistence on watching the diner. His father's strange, brittle mood every time the land vote came up in conversation. The way Richard had always changed the subject smoothly but firmly whenever Cole asked why one particular block of Main Street mattered so much more to him than any other property in town. Finally restless, he pulled up an old family photo album his mother had kept before she passed. Flipping slowly through pages he hadn't looked at in years. His mother had died when Cole was 19, and in the years since he'd let himself believe that whatever grief his father carried afterward explained the way Richard had grown colder. More controlling, more determined to build something large enough to matter. Cole had spent years trying to earn approval from a man who measured everything in land and leverage, never once questioning too closely how his father had built the empire he was so proud of. Halfway through the album, he stopped. A newspaper clipping yellowed with age tucked between two photographs. A short article about a young local attorney who had, according to the brief paragraph, relocated unexpectedly 15 years earlier, amid what the piece vaguely called ongoing property disputes in the area. The photograph accompanying the article showed a woman's face. Cole's breath caught. It was Marlowe's face, or close enough to it that the resemblance sent a cold shock straight through his chest. He read the name beneath the photograph 3 times before it fully landed. Renata. He thought about his father's expression in that parking lot, the color draining from his face. The word he'd murmured barely audible, like a man seeing something he'd spent 15 years convincing himself he'd successfully buried. It can't be. Cole sat there a long time, the album open in his lap, piecing together a story he was only now beginning to understand the shape of. A mother who vanished. A father who never once spoke of her. A pattern of land purchases that had always seemed to a boy growing up comfortable and oblivious, like simply the ordinary business of being wealthy in a small town. He thought about the girl in the parking lot, calm and unshaken, telling him he'd knocked something out of his own jacket worth more than he'd ever understand. Maybe she hadn't been talking about a piece of metal at all. Maybe she'd been talking about whatever conscience he still had left buried somewhere, under years of trying to be exactly the kind of son his father wanted. He didn't sleep at all that night. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, he found himself standing in front of the bathroom mirror, studying his own face for a long time, looking for his father in it and finding for the first time in his life that he badly wanted not to find him there. The council hearing began at 10 the next morning, held in the town's small municipal building, folding chairs arranged in rows beneath fluorescent lights, a long table at the front where 5 council members sat with name placards and glasses of water. Nobody was drinking. The room filled faster than anyone expected. Harold arrived early, exactly as he'd promised, claiming a seat in the front row. Doris came on her lunch break, still wearing her badge from the records office. Officer Reyes stood quietly near the back wall off duty, but present anyway. Preston arrived just before 10, briefcase in hand, taking a seat near the front, where he could stand quickly if the council needed an outside attorney's word on what they were about to see. Ferris sat near the front, Marlowe beside him, Walt on her other side, and Renata dressed simply, hair pulled back, sitting just behind them, close enough to reach forward and rest a steadying hand on her daughter's shoulder. Richard Draven arrived precisely on time. Composed, confident, the same practiced calm he wore into every room he intended to control. He saw Marlowe first. Then a beat later, he saw the woman sitting behind her. Whatever color remained in his face drained out completely. "That's not possible," he said, quiet enough that only the people nearest him heard it. "Good morning, Richard," Renata said evenly, holding his gaze without flinching. "It's been a long time." The council chair called the meeting to order before Richard could respond, moving briskly through preliminary business, unaware entirely of the storm quietly gathering in the third row. When the agenda reached the Main Street rezoning proposal, Richard rose smoothly, delivering the same polished presentation he'd clearly rehearsed dozens of times before: projections and figures, promises of revitalization and economic growth. Careful not to mention a single business by name that would actually be displaced. When he finished, the council chair opened the floor for public comment. Marlowe stood. Her legs trembled slightly beneath her, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "My name is Marlowe Ashwood," she said. "Some of you know me from Ferris's Diner. Some of you may have heard a version of events from this past week that isn't entirely accurate." She held up the folded police statement. "I was assaulted in a parking lot 8 days ago by Cole Draven. I defended myself using nothing more than basic self-defense techniques. This statement, filed the same night with local police, confirms that a count time-stamped before any for any other version of events was ever circulated." A murmur moved through the room. Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing yet. "2 nights ago," Marlowe continued, "a storage unit was broken into and emptied of documents that would have shown a pattern of land fraud spanning 3 generations of the Draven family. I was accused of that theft despite having no knowledge the unit even existed." She paused, letting that settle. "I didn't take those documents," she said. "But I know who did, and more importantly, I know that a second copy of everything survived." She turned, and Renata rose slowly to stand beside her, the leather-bound book held carefully in both hands. A collective gasp moved through the room, as several older residents recognized her face, memory stirring after 15 years of careful absence. "My name," Renata said clearly, "was Renata Ashwood. 15 years ago, I was an attorney investigating a pattern of forged land transfers connected to Draven property holdings. I was forced into hiding when my safety and the safety of my 4-year-old daughter was directly threatened by the man standing at that podium." Richard's composure finally cracked. "This is absurd," he said, voice rising. "I don't know what story this woman is telling, but I have never threatened anyone in my life." "You told me," Renata said, voice steady despite the tremor beneath it, "that a young single mother was vulnerable in ways I might not have fully considered. Do you remember saying that, Richard? Because I remember every single word of it." The room had gone completely silent now, every eye fixed on the front of the hall. Renata opened the leather book and began laying documents out on the table in front of the council, one after another. Forged signatures beside verified originals. Financial records showing payments timed suspiciously close to property transfers. A list of names, mostly elderly landowners, many of them no longer living, all connected to the same pattern spanning 3 decades. Preston rose briefly from his seat, introducing himself to the council as an outside attorney, with no ties to the town, confirming that he had personally reviewed the handwriting analysis and financial records the night before, and found the pattern, in his professional opinion, both consistent and deeply concerning. It was a short statement offered without drama, but it landed with exactly the outside credibility Renata had hoped it would. The council chair, visibly shaken, called for a brief recess to review the material. During that same recess, before Cole ever rose from the back row, an unexpected thing happened. Harold stood up, first cap in his weathered hands, and asked respectfully but firmly if he might add something to the record. The council chair, still gathering herself, nodded. "I've farmed corn outside this town for 50-some years," Harold said, voice carrying clear across the quiet room. Knew Otis Bell most of my life. Good man. Confused near the end about a lot of paperwork he never should have had to handle alone. I always wondered how his land ended up sold off so quiet after he passed. Guess now I understand. He sat back down, and a moment later, Doris rose from her seat near the aisle. I've worked the county records office for over 20 years, she said. I can confirm the filing patterns Ms. Ashwood is describing. Several parcels along Main Street changed hands through the same small management firm, always right around a family's hardest season. I never had the full picture until today. I wish I had. 2 more residents stood after that. An elderly widow whose late husband had once mentioned troubling questions about their own boundary lines, and a middle-aged man whose grandmother had lost acreage decades earlier under circumstances the family had simply accepted as ordinary bad luck at the time. None of it was dramatic. No raised voices, no accusations shouted across the room. Just ordinary people, one after another, adding small, honest pieces to a picture that had taken 15 years and one very patient young woman to finally bring fully into the light. It was during that recess that Cole Draven stood up from the back row where he'd been sitting quietly, the entire hearing unnoticed until now. I have something to say, he said, voice rough. Richard turned sharply toward his son. Cole, sit down. No, Cole said, and something in his voice made even his father go quiet. I've spent a week trying to understand why you looked so scared in that parking lot. I finally understand now. He walked slowly to the front of the room, ignoring his father's furious glare. I hit her, he said, looking directly at Marlowe. 8 days ago, unprovoked. I want that on record clearly because I let people believe a different story for too long, and I'm done doing that. He turned to face the council. My father told me to watch the diner. Told me to make sure nobody dug up old paperwork before this vote. I didn't ask enough questions about why. I should have. His voice caught just slightly. I found a newspaper clipping in my mother's old photo album last night, he continued. About a woman named Renata, who apparently disappeared 15 years ago under circumstances nobody in my family ever fully explained to me. I think I just watched her walk into this room. He looked at his father one last time, something broken and finally honest passing between them. I don't know everything that happened 15 years ago, Cole said. But I know what I saw in that parking lot. And I know I'm not willing to keep protecting whatever my father's been hiding just because he's my father. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before it. Richard Draven stood very still at the front of the room. The polished control he'd worn his entire adult life, finally visibly cracking apart in front of the entire town. Everything I did, he said, voice low, almost to himself, I did to build something for this family. You built it on stolen ground, Renata said, and threats against a 4-year-old child. That's not a legacy, Richard. That's a crime. The council chair, returning from recess, with the reviewed documents in hand, called the meeting back to order, her expression grave. Given the severity of what's been presented today, she said, this council is postponing the rezoning vote indefinitely, pending a full investigation by county authorities. Mr. Draven, I'd strongly advise you retain legal counsel before this meeting concludes. Officer Reyes stepped forward from the back wall, quiet and steady, and asked Richard Draven to step outside with him to answer some preliminary questions. Richard didn't resist. He simply looked one last time at Marlowe and Renata standing together at the front of the room, and something in his face for just a moment looked almost like relief. The exhausted relief of a man finally set down a weight he'd carried and hidden for far too long. At the door he paused, turning back toward his son. Cole. Cole met his father's eyes steady, despite the tremor Marlowe could see moving through his jaw. I don't have anything to say to you right now, Cole said. Maybe I will eventually. Not today. Richard nodded once slow, something that might have been the closest thing to respect he'd shown his son in years, passing briefly across his face, and let Officer Reyes lead him out through the double doors into the cold morning air. The room stayed quiet for a long moment, after the door swung shut behind them, the weight of everything that had just happened settling slowly over the gathered crowd. Then gently, an unexpected sound broke the silence. Somewhere near the back, someone had started clapping, slow at first, uncertain. And then more people joined in, not celebrating exactly, but honoring something the way a town claps for itself, when it finally remembers what it's capable of standing up for. Marlo didn't feel triumphant sitting there in the middle of it. Mostly she felt tired and unbearably grateful, and aware more than anything of just how much quiet courage it had taken from so many different people to get this one room to this one moment. He was formally arrested 3 days later, once county investigators had corroborated enough of the documentation to move forward with charges of fraud, forgery, and witness intimidation, spanning back over a decade. The news moved through town differently than the rumors had 2 weeks earlier. Slower this time. Quieter. People didn't gather in excited little clusters to gossip about it the way they had over the parking lot story. Mostly, they just sat with it the way you sit with news that reshapes how you understood your own town's history. Ferris heard the news standing behind his counter and set down the coffee pot he'd been holding for a long moment before saying anything at all. 15 years, he said to nobody in particular. I always wondered why she left so sudden. I told myself all kinds of stories over the years. Never once landed anywhere close to the truth. He reopened the storage unit investigation with county officials the following week, and within days, most of the original documents Ferris had spent years trying to locate turned up in an evidence locker, seized from a rented garage belonging to one of Richard's property managers, a man who'd been the one to actually cut that padlock, acting on instructions he'd been too afraid to question at the time. The property manager cooperated fully, once questioned, eager to distance himself from a scandal, far larger than the quiet favors he'd assumed he was doing for a respected local businessman. The diner was saved. The rezoning vote never happened. Main Street stayed exactly as it had always been worn, brick and warm windows, and a wall of old photographs that would keep right on growing. Renata, once the immediate legal dust began to settle, found herself for the first time in 15 years able to simply exist in town under her own name again. It felt strange at first, she admitted to Marlo one evening, hearing people call her Renata instead of Corinne. Like trying on a coat she hadn't worn in a very long time and discovering with some relief that it still fit. She and Marlo spent that first week mostly just talking, filling in 15 years of gaps, small ordinary things as much as the large painful ones. Favorite foods, old songs, the exact shade of blue Marlo had loved as a small child, according to Renata, and had apparently never quite outgrown if the color of her bedroom curtains was any indication. Walt hovered nearby through most of it, quietly relieved, refilling coffee cups and staying just present enough to remind them both gently that he wasn't going anywhere either. 2 weeks after the hearing, on a bright, cold Saturday morning, a small gathering formed outside the town's police station. Officer Reyes' supervisor, the town's sheriff, had reached out personally after hearing the full story from him, insisting on a small ceremony most people in town wouldn't have thought to ask for. A wall inside the station lobby held photographs of officers who had served the town honorably over the decades. Marlo's father had never been one of them, though she'd only recently learned through records Renata helped her track down that her own father had briefly served as a reserve officer years before Marlo was born, before life took him elsewhere entirely, a quiet detail that explained at last where some of her own steadiness had first taken root. Renata told her more about him that week than she had in the entire 19 years before it. A steady, easygoing man named Thomas, gone from an illness before Marlo turned 2, remembered mostly now, in small inherited details. The way Marlo tilted her head when she was thinking something through. The particular careful way she checked a room before fully entering it. Habits passed down quietly, the way habits often are, long after the person who first modeled them is gone. He would have loved watching you grow into exactly who you are. Renata told her the night before the ceremony, sitting together on Walt's porch steps under a sky full of stars. Neither of them had properly looked at together in far too long. Steady, careful, willing to stand your ground without ever needing to raise your voice to do it. The sheriff added a small brass plaque that morning honoring the reserve officers who'd served the town without ever seeking recognition for it. Marlowe's father's name included among them for the very first time. Marlowe stood in front of that wall, the small metal shield from her jacket pocket now resting safely in a display case beside the plaque donated quietly the week before. Renata stood on one side of her, Walt on the other. Ferris had closed the diner for 2 hours that morning, driving over with a box of fresh pie to share with everyone who came. Even Cole showed up, standing a respectful distance back, hands in his pockets, having spent the past 2 weeks cooperating fully with investigators and beginning in small, quiet ways the long work of becoming a different kind of man than the one who'd once grabbed a stranger's delivery bag in the rain. He'd started that same week volunteering 3 afternoons at the county's Elder Services office, helping review paperwork for residents who wanted a second set of eyes before signing anything involving their land or savings. Nobody had asked him to. It was, he told Marlowe quietly, when she asked why, the only kind of apology that felt like it actually meant something, rather than just sounding like one. Harold clapped him on the shoulder, at one point an unexpected gesture of grace Cole clearly hadn't been braced for. "Everybody gets exactly one chance to prove who they really are," Harold told him. "Looks like you're finally taking yours." Cole nodded, throat tight, unable to quite manage words in response. The ceremony itself was small. A few words from the sheriff, a moment of quiet. The gentle clink of a plaque being hung properly on the wall it had waited 15 years to reach. Afterward, standing outside in the cold morning sun, Marlowe wrapped both arms around her mother, feeling for the first time in her life the particular warmth of being held by someone who had spent every single day since her childhood, loving her from whatever careful distance safety demanded. "I used to wonder," Marlowe said, "why I always felt like I was missing something. Even with Uncle Walt. Even with a good life." "You weren't missing something," Renata said, resting her chin gently against her daughter's hair. "You were carrying something. All this time. Something I gave you before I ever had to leave." "What's that?" "Patience," Renata said softly. "The kind that outlasts even the people who try hardest to bury it." Walt stood a few steps away, watching the two of them together. Something at peace finally settling behind his tired eyes after 15 long years of standing guard alone. Spring came slowly to the town that year, the way it always did. Mud giving way to green, giving way eventually to long warm evenings on porches all across Main Street. Marlowe went back to her classes that following Monday, though something in how she carried herself through them had shifted permanently. Her criminal justice professor, unaware of most of what had happened, still remarked one afternoon that her case analysis had grown sharper, more grounded, as though she'd started studying the law from the inside of something lived, rather than only from the outside of a textbook. She wasn't wrong. Ferris offered Marlowe her old job back the very same week the charges against Richard were formally filed. She took it gladly, though these days she split her hours between the diner and a part-time internship Renata helped arrange with the county's legal aid office, learning firsthand exactly the kind of quiet, patient work her mother had once given up everything to pursue. Renata joined her there most Thursdays, the two of them working side by side at adjoining desks, a small, ordinary miracle neither of them ever quite got used to taking for granted. Cole's case moved slower, working itself through the legal consequences of that one rainy night parking lot decision community service and a formal restitution agreement, eventually settling the matter without further conflict needed on either side. He kept volunteering at Elder Services long after the requirement technically expired. Having found somewhere in those quiet afternoons, reviewing paperwork for nervous seniors, something that felt more honest than anything his father had ever taught him about what real strength actually looked like. Richard Draven's trial was still pending as that first spring turned towards summer, the full weight of 15 years of careful documentation slowly working its way through a legal system that, however imperfect, had finally been given everything it needed to do its job properly. Ferris kept a new photograph on that wall by the register from then on, right alongside the farmers and their prize hogs, the baseball teams in uniforms long out of style, the faded 4th of July parade. A photograph of 3 people standing outside a police station on a cold, bright morning, arms around each other, finally after everything simply and quietly whole. This town remembers itself in that diner. And from that morning forward, it remembered this too. If there's one thing worth carrying with you from this story long after the credits roll on whatever screen you're watching it on tonight, let it be this. The world will always have its share of people who mistake gentleness for weakness, who see someone quiet or young or overlooked and assume there's nothing underneath worth respecting. They're almost always wrong. Somewhere behind every steady, patient face is a whole history you haven't earned the right to see yet. A whole family of people who loved that person fiercely enough to teach them exactly how to survive whatever the world eventually threw at them. Treat people gently. Not because you're certain they're powerful. Treat them gently because you never actually know for certain that they aren't. That's the whole lesson, really wrapped up in one rainy parking lot. One torn jacket collar, one small metal shield, finally hung where it always belonged. Some debts take 15 years to come due, but they always eventually come due. And somewhere in a small town, not so different from your own, an old farmer is still holding a diner door open a little longer than he needs to. A records clerk is still keeping half an eye out for anyone who looks like they could use a small unasked for kindness. A young woman who once learned to carry pain quietly is learning at last what it feels like to set some of it down. That's not the end of the story. Stories like this one never really end. They just keep being told quietly, town by town, one act of steady kindness at a time by anyone patient enough to notice they're still needed.